Well, in the beginning, it was very informal. Those of us who had gone to convention happened to run into each other in a gay bar. And I don't know, maybe some of us still had our convention badge on and didn't realize it, but that's how we identified, or we just started talking to somebody and said, oh, you're here for a convention. Which convention are you here for? And we found out we're here for the same convention, and so that's how we began to get together. And then in 88 or 89, I believe it was, the convention was in Boston, and there was a gay bed and breakfast or gay guest house within walking distance from the convention hotel and all. And lo and behold, almost every room was filled up with LGBT audiologist, speech pathologist. And if I'm not mistaken, it might have been all men. I don't remember there being any women at that B&B or guest house. I think it was all men. And, over breakfast or coming back in the evenings and so forth, we were just sitting around and talking. And that's how we began to kind of get together and organize to our thoughts. And, people were losing jobs and not being hired and being discriminated against in all kinds of ways. And students were too. And so that's when we said, we got to do something about this. And we began to talk about forming the organization and trying to become a little more political.
I joined the GASP as soon as I heard about it. And that was quite an experience. They were called GASP at the time. It was a bunch of gay guys that got together. And then they decided to become a little more serious about it by the time I got there. And so all of us women sat around and we got together when we looked at them all and said, okay, here's the thing. GASP was gay, audiologist and speech pathologist. So we can be GASPL, to put the lesbians in there, or we can be GLASP, or we can be LGASP. And of course, all the guys went, oh, LGASP, that sounds great. and that's how we became LGASP.
I think that my first convention was the one in Seattle in, when was it, 90, something like that. And a friend and I started seeing posters for a meeting. And, but we also saw that the posters were being torn down. And that made me mad. So we, I don't have a lot of details. I can't remember a lot from that time, but I just remember that the posters were being torn down, and it made me go to that meeting and just start to get involved in what was going on. I think it was in Atlanta that Richard came out to the, general body. And I think that's kind of when things started they started embracing us more.
Legislative councils, when all legislative councilors from all states would meet at once at the ASHA Convention. Mm-hmm. And this was in 1991 when I lived in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I was I was elected to the legislative council there. And when you're at the legislative council on a Friday night at the time, that's how they did it then, there was what we call the legislative council forum. You could go up to the front of the podium and say whatever you wanted to say. If you wanted to say that your husband died, your father died, you could say it if you wanted to. Mm-hmm. Whatever you wanted to say, you could say. And I remember that the guy before me, may he rest in peace, he's passed away by now, but he was from Maine. And he came up there every year, I found out. He always was the first one up there to complain about something. And I don't even remember what he was complaining about. So as he was talking, I wasn't paying much attention to it. I was just paying attention to when he finished, because I thought, okay, I'm going to go up there now and tell him who I am. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing here. So when he finished, I went up to the microphone, and Joe Melcher was a counselor at the time from Louisiana. He was in the audience, and he said he heard me speak for 8 minutes. And I spoke and came out to the whole legislative council. There's like 435 members of the legislative council, something like that. And I came out to them in 1991. And when I finished talking and I said, thank you, and I walked back to my seat, the whole place stood up and applauded me.
I was actually at council, and on legislative council at that time, it was, you know, much bigger organization than it is now. And we had a member forum, and then we had a legislative counselor forum as part of what we did. And that was the time when you could sign up and you get up and each of 5 minutes. You talk about whatever you wanted to. And I was kind of ticked off that we were using these Tyvek envelopes because you can't recycle them and you couldn't, you know, really reuse them. And I just thought they're really bad for the environment. So I had a whole pile of them all tied together. And I signed up and I was going to get up and officially return them so they could use them again and talk about that. And sitting next to me was Richard Adler. And he went before me. So he stood up and he basically came out to the entire council and talked about GASP. And, you know, people were crying. And it was really pretty impressive. And I'm like, how the hell do I follow that? I had no idea what I was going to say. So I got up there and, you know, kind of said that and did my little thing and then walked right over to Richard and said, sign me up.
That's a really funny question, actually, because so I should have known. Like, it's so funny, these funny realizations, because I went to ASHA conventions periodically, and I remember like actively looking up in the program, trying to find where the LGASP meeting was, and like almost going, but then not. And I don't know what I was afraid of. I guess I was afraid of my own realizations, but I would see it and I would read it and I would almost close my eyes and imagine that I was going there, almost like a Cinderella ball moment or something. I don't know. And it was a funny little memory that I have. But so when I actually like owned the identity of bisexual, I sort of felt, okay, well, I'm gonna go now. And so I think that I joined to find some level of acceptance in myself, but also largely though to support the movement within our profession, because I just was like, this isn't getting done. And I'm a professor at a university. I'm supposed to be the one that is, you know, doing the research and trying to implement the policies. And, you know, my university pays for me to do service. This is my job. And so I sort of, I guess, joined for those reasons.
So, you know, I'll tell you this. It was embracing, and especially because we first, you know, started dealing with the Office of Multicultural Affairs, right? Which I believe back then was called the Office of Minority Concerns. And so one of the things that came up was, do we belong with them or not? Because was that office really for ethnic racial minorities, not us, right? But it was certainly all embracing, all about guidance, all about getting involved. At a certain point in the early 90s, the board of directors started meeting with the different multicultural groups, because at that point, so LGASP was forming, right? So I would say by 93, 94, LGASP was LGASP, the Hispanic caucus was the Hispanic caucus. We had helped the Asian caucus start. Eventually there was an Asian Indian, and then the Asian became Asian Pacific Islander, etc. But then that's how we started then. And the board of directors was actually, members of the board of directors were meeting with us and bringing stuff back to the board of directors. Back then, the way the association was run was very different. We had a legislative council. There were like 150 counselors, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, no, and at the national office, there was always help and actually some people coming up with ideas. What was interesting as we were getting started was to find out that at the national office, the culture was very anti-gay lesbian. And there were actually staff in the national office that were not comfortable coming out. That was interesting. And that made us then also start thinking about, again, these workshops. And there was a series of workshops done to the national office staff in person, paid for by ASHA. And that was Bob Peppard and Tony Salisbury. So Tony probably remembers more of that and the content. There were some really well-received workshops, by the way.
What I did with Tony Salisbury was we put together, after the survey had been conducted, we put together a mini seminar at ASHA, is it 93? I forget what the year was of that first presentation, on homophobia in the speech and hearing workplace. It was filled to capacity in a very large room. Somewhere there exists an audio tape recording of that presentation. I don't know how ASHA handles it these days, but it was the beginnings of them audio taping seminars so people could listen at a later date to them. And we got a copy of it, and it's around someplace. I'm sure ASHA must have copies of that kind of material someplace. At any rate, back to homophobia issues. Someone who wasn't part of GASP was assigned to the seminar to be the facilitator of the program. So like introducing the speakers, fielding questions from the audience, you know, everything a facilitator does in a public speaking event. So this person was assigned. She was nice. She refused to say the word gay. She refused to say the word homosexual. She substituted, how she did it, I don't know, but she did. She never said the word gay, she never said the word lesbian, and she never said the word homosexual, despite the fact it was all over our introductory materials. Code shifting, that's what it is, isn't it? She was changing everything up on the fly. Well, it was just kind of astounding to be sitting there about to deliver a program on homophobia, and we've got Exhibit 1 introducing us.
Right.
So weird. Positives from that first presentation, the number of people who came up to Tony or me after the presentation to say, oh my God. I'm getting a little verklempt. You sometimes don't realize how you're touching people. One of them was a woman in an army uniform who worked in a medical setting, and it was just after Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I think, and how she couldn't stay in the military any longer, but in order to get her honorable discharge, she was going to suck it up for the duration of her tour of duty. And but she thanked us so much to know within the profession, I'm going to have some resources I can call on. So, you know, it was great.
Bob Peppard and I published an article called Open Doors in the ASHA magazine. And I don't remember what year that was. The hate mail that came into the ASHA office was unbelievable. They called us up and, were reading things to us and saying, do we publish these so that people know what's going on? Or is this just too defeating for people to hear who are gay and lesbian? They don't want to hear that kind of stuff. They were really in a dilemma about it. And so we sort of picked and chose what kinds of letters should be actually published and which ones shouldn't, just because it was just this barrage of horrible, the stuff they said was just terrible. So, and being in that kind of position where you're in a voluntary organization where you're trying to do educational stuff for people, so they can start to learn how to, be with, colleagues who are gay and lesbian and not feel awkward. And then you're getting these kinds of letters and that kind of stuff. It's really difficult because you don't have the power to do anything to help them really, except to be a support.
And at the time, we were really not fighting with ASHA. I don't think we were fighting with ASHA. I don't think any of us were fighters. We were more, let's work within the system. Joe Melcher and Richard Adler and Terry Salisbury, they were all on legislative council at the time. So we worked within ASHA and we were able to make some pretty good headway. Thank goodness for people like Vicki Williams. I think at first she was a little hesitant, but Vicki to this day is a friend of mine, and we still talk about those early days of the struggle and becoming recognized.
There was some resistance for sure. There were a few people. I think there probably still are. I think that two people who stand out that probably were influential at the bigger ASHA level, and one was Joe Melcher when he came out as his during acceptance of his fellows. I think it was his fellowship that he a fellow of the Academy. And then Vicki Williams also I think has been very over the years very good about including GASP in multicultural affairs and being an advocate. And I think now that she's moved on up the ladder in ASHA, I think that portends well. But there were other folks. Ted Massengill, of course. I've worked with him a lot. I was secretary, I guess, from 2009 to 17. So in the leadership of GASP, and a couple of other folks. I think Richard Adler, looking at transgender voice. I think all of those folks. Those aren't the only ones, but those were some that I think really kind of took LGBTQ out into ASHA.
The first time I ever heard of GASP was when I was in my CFY experience, and one of our conservative speech pathologists that I worked with came back from the ASHA Convention rolling her eyes about how the gays were just shoving it into people's faces about and she was just like, it's okay, you just don't have to shove it into all of our faces. And I just remember going, I don't think that's what's happening, but interesting. She talked about how there were like people like walking down the hall and with signs, and how like disturbing that all was. And so that was my first kind of, and that was in 1997, 1998 kind of a thing. And then the other thing that happened was I became an ASHA intern when I was a PhD student, because they were helping to fund our research. And on one of the items on our survey, we had what topics do you teach in your classes regarding multicultural issues? And so we had things like race, ethnicity, multilingualism, those kinds of things. And then I had put on there the option of sexual orientation. And I remember we had ASHA's multicultural people affairs review our survey to give us feedback. And they actually asked us to change that item. And I was very naive. I was very like kind of submissive, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And so I was like, why? And so they were like, well, that's just a very controversial topic. And I remember the back part of my mind was like, yeah, that's why we're doing this survey. Like, it's almost more reason to put it on there. But I remember going, okay, but it's just like, we don't want backlash from our members for that item on your survey. And I was like, all right. And so I remember I compromised and put gender, and thinking that maybe that would satisfy whatever. And I really regret that I caved in that respect, but nevertheless, it's what happened. But that stuck with me. I was like, and then as an ASHA intern, we did a site visitor training for helping people find multicultural issues and how people were infusing that in the program. And I was talking with, they gave me a tour of ASHA, and they were walking me through, and I remember asking about how was the, I thought it was great that ASHA's multicultural affairs team was embracing the topic of sexual orientation, you know, as a new, because it's kind of a new, that was one of the newer constituency groups. And I remember being told, well, there's a lot of division in the office about that, and that some people really question whether we should be doing that or not. And that kind of stuck with me a little bit. So, but that would have been like early 2000s, largely probably around the time when those terrible letters to the editors, ASHA leader, were starting to come out. So I guess that's how I see it. I'm very buoyed by the fact that ASHA did publish the supporting gender diverse communities, and that was a very huge effort that we did, and we spent a very long time creating that. So I guess I'm seeing that in the positive. I'm very happy about that, but of course there's other things that we still have to work on.
I do remember with really positive regard when scholarships became part of the purpose. I think there's a period of time, probably in the 90s and maybe early aughts, where there's a recognition that LGBT students can really use some support for master's programs, especially. Because I think some folks are discouraged when they feel like the field is not one where you can be really open and be yourself. And that was more the case then than it is now. It's kind of refreshing. The last few years I was teaching, I think I taught until 2017, how refreshing it was to see the attitude, not just of LGBTQ students, but their allies. And I think, well, at least in my program, there's probably 80% female, and it seems like even cisgender straight females often are way more interested in allyship than, you know, at least maybe in Southern California. It seemed like that was the majority of folks had such a positive attitude. The graduate student clinicians we've had in the Transgender Voice and Comm Clinic have pretty much all been cisgender women. You know, so, and there's amazing empathy that's developed for trans men and trans women there. And that's one of the things we wanted to do is, in a way, is you humanize the whole experience of being with and being part of a program of education and care for an individual so that they might live more authentically. And then, you know, when the other students go, wow, you got to be in that clinic, it was hard to get interviewed. And, you know, it's just that interest and that positive regard it's something that makes me really happy.
You know, I was giving thought to one of the things you had on your question list was, are there individuals through ASHA who you think have, I can't remember the whole question, of course, right now, but who you think have been instrumental in advancing, I don't know, the area that LGASP has focused on, and do you think that ASHA, or have we been instrumental at all in kind of broadening from just lesbian, gay, bisexual to including, you know, kind of that whole continuum? And I can't think of one individual. Like, you know, I do think that when Jerry Logeman moved ASHA from Cincinnati, and I was trying to remember what year that was, and I know it caused a big flap with some people and not with others. But I think that was a real turning point. And I think part of your question about that was, did LGASP have anything to do with it? And I don't know. Sure, Joe Melcher spoke up, because Joe would speak up about a lot of things. But that would be a guess on my part. I don't remember. I'm sure it got talked about. My memory's not that good about that.
Professionally, ASHA, because I did a lot of work with ASHA, which we may get to later, where we actually moved the convention out of Cincinnati, which I wrote that resolution. That was, it was my ideas, which I can get into now or later, but took it through a whole bunch of different levels. But to give a little bit more in that resolution, because as I told Joe, I said, that's probably what I'll speak to, is at the time I was president of our state association in Massachusetts. There were Bob Papard. I don't know if Tony was involved, because I think it was somebody, it was just Massachusetts, I think. It was Bob, he was at Northeastern, I think, myself, and somebody else. There's like 4 of us, and I said, I would like to, here's how I see this going, so that it has support from grassroots all the way to the national office. So the 4 of us got together, we wrote something up, we passed it. I took it to the executive board of MASHA. They voted on it. Then I took it with their permission, because I was on a committee of information and something for the Council of State Association Presidents, called CSAP, which I later became president of 2 years later, a year later. But I was on a committee, took it to that Issues and Planning Committee. They accepted it. We took it to the floor, which all the state associations are there. And back then, all 50 states, or just about all 50 states, came to that meeting. And it was in Charleston, South Carolina, if that helps. If you look at the CSEP website, you'll probably be able to find, I think it was like 92 or something. And, and out of the 50 states, 11 states abstained on the vote. 2 or 3 voted no, and the rest voted yes. So there was like 38 or something, that 37 voted yes. And I remember Jan Fairchild, who's now a minister in New Hampshire, but she was the state president from Indianapolis. And she was this very much of very spiritual, but I was, yeah, she was just very, not loud, outspoken, but very academic, very precise in her words. But she got up when the 11 states abstained and said, if you are abstaining from this because you think you haven't made up your mind, let me inform you that you already have. And it was such a powerful statement. It was basically telling people, like, own your bias, own your bigotry, you know? And like, if you think you're sitting here because you haven't made up your mind, let me inform you that you already have. And because it was an issue that you just don't go middle of the road or don't make a decision. So then we went from there to the legislative council, but you have to go to like a resolutions committee that forwarded on, it gets formatted and rewritten and so forth. Went to the legislative council, which I sat on at the time also. Little discussion, and which is always scary, bothers me, because around Jedi discussions, we sit in an ivory tower in academia, and there's this nice, oh yes, I talk about race and I talk about orientation, I talk about whatever in my classes, and it bothers me because the reality on the ground is it's not pretty, it's not nice, and we need to have a lot harder conversations, or create space for more difficult conversations that are difficult, safe, but difficult. And that's where the rubber hits the road. So it passed unanimously at LC, like unanimously. And I was like, and everybody felt great about it. I felt better about the CSAP one because it kind of showed the colors of really what was going on in our country, that a third were uncomfortable, with it, or at least I'm assuming they were. So it passed, and then a year or 2 years later, we moved out of Cincinnati, went to Orlando, actually had to change the dates. I think we changed the dates to like a week later. And there was some fallout from that, but not, ASHA is financially sound enough to be able to take that load. Yeah.
I know that it started off as like pretty much a group of gay men, and then of course lesbian women began to join, and then as we started to understand that all of this is existing on a continuum, I always found it kind of regretful that we have the name LGASP, or the acronym that doesn't include bisexual or trans people, but I think that that is probably the biggest thing that LGASP is, I think, embracing is we're starting to see a lot more support and acceptance for the people in the middle of the spectrum and for trans people in general. I'm hoping very much that, we have largely been a predominantly white, the whole profession is predominantly white, but like we've predominantly been white members, and I'm really enthused and excited about this collaboration that we have with the other constituency groups, and the support that we're seeing from them, particularly the Hispanic caucus. Like, they are amazing, and the Asian Pacific Islander caucus is like driving this collaboration among the groups, like in a way I've never before seen, and I'm so excited about all of those things. So I'm hoping that we're going to see a future that is more inclusive of diversity that's not just related to gender and sexual orientation.
It's a good question. So I think that at first we came together out of necessity almost, to find a home with others who were willing to be open about their sexuality, and to help change the profession's view of lesbian and gays within the profession. So I think it was a close-knit little group. We used to do things socially together all the time. I think with time and that normalization, I think the need subsided a bit. And so I think that was probably the lull in the group. I think we're at another period in history. You know, the historical pendulum seems to be swinging back to just more discrimination in general. And we know hate crimes have been up in the past few years. So I think I would like to see LGASP remain strong and continue to advocate for people in our profession of all sexualities.
So when I joined LGASP, one of the issues that LGASP was working on was how to include more men in the profession. And I think just getting away from that, so that the topics in the meeting aren't how can we include more men and how are men doing in the profession. It is how are non-white individuals doing in our profession, how are non-binary, individuals doing in our profession. I think we have a long way to go. We've come a long way. I see that, but I really do think that we still need to make more of an effort. I think if the leadership was not, if we could make more of an effort to get, Black and Brown and Indigenous people in the leadership, that would be huge. I think that, just having like a website, and having a Facebook group. We've always gone to MC Squared afterward, which, has, I think, been the effort. But yeah, so I guess changing the goals of GASP.
Well, like you said, we first started out as GASP, and then the ladies came along and said, hey, what about us? That became LGASP. And then just like I said, all those letters started adding on. I know it's more than that, but it also depends on people that if you don't, well, I don't want to sound like I'm preaching at all. But yes, I think we're open to anybody, but if you don't, how do I say this without sounding holier than thou? But years ago, no one wanted to be out as a bisexual person, or they didn't want to. So we didn't know that we weren't open to them if they didn't let us know. You know what I'm saying? So, but I think as people learn to accept themselves and get to be more outspoken about themselves, then we'll just fold them into our group. That's what we want to do.
I think specifically Luis, as well as going through the multicultural caucus every year, has really helped. Reach out, and also we get to know their caucuses better, and they get to know our caucus, and it ends up there are a lot of cross members. But we're probably still mostly a white male organization, and but like I said, I haven't been to a membership meeting in 3 or 4 years, so I don't know if that's still true. I know one fellow who finally graduated 3 or 4 years ago with a master's, because he had been trying to get into a program, but he's from San Diego, no, LA. Now he works in the LA public schools, but he was gay, and he reached out to me, and he's gay, Hispanic, and speaks Spanish. And he reached out to me wanting advice, and then I sent him to Greg Loff, and somehow, after a few tries, he passed his the praxis exam. And there's a lot of barriers that ASHA still has that prevents diverse groups. Mm-hmm. I'm still a site visitor for the CAA, and I was on the CAA for 4 years. That's the Council on Academic Accreditation. Mm-hmm. And the GASP always had problems with the CAA because the CAA wasn't enforcing the non-discrimination policy. And when I started with the CAA in 2012, they weren't enforcing the non-discrimination policy, and I kept mentioning it to them and kept mentioning it to them, and we hear you, Bob, we hear you, Bob, and nothing was changing. But finally, over time, they changed it, and then I'm now a site visitor for a few years, and they're still changing and making it better. But they could certainly do better, because we have, in fact, they just asked for CAA site visitor input yesterday online, and my issue with them is we're still allowing discriminatory institutions, the religious base, so it's federal law about that, but we're still allowing them to get CAAs. But I think if we're really serious about what we do, and we're really serious about our scope of practice and our code of ethics, how could we could conscious generate somebody from Falwell University or whatever that's called, and they learn how to pray away a speech problem. You know, they have prayer sessions instead of doing therapy sessions, or you know, if you're gay in Baylor, or you've heard all that before, Salt Lake, if Provo, then you know you're just washed out. And why are they still doing that? And they keep saying it's because of federal law. So federal law has to change for ASHA to do anything. But fortunately, there are more and more religious institutions. I've been on one last year to a virtual one, to a Baptist institution in Texas, and they don't discriminate, even though they're Baptist, because they feel their local issues are more important than the national issues. So even as Baptists, they accept the gay and lesbian students and faculty. And I remember in a lot of the GASP meetings before I joined the CAA, it took me six tries to get on the CAA. So I put in an application for every year for 6 years, and I always said I was gay, and Joe Melcher said, why don't you take that out and see what happens? So the 6th time I took that out, and they took me.
Just generally people feeling more comfortable, whether it was through LGASP or just our own personal experiences. I mean, I can tell you when I lived in Pittsburgh, and certainly when I became a parent with lesbian parents, or, you know, really I'm kind of bisexual, but whatever I am, parents, you know, you can't hide at all, because you're out in public with your children, or you're in a classroom talking about, you know, people say, well, how was the weekend? You know, you're either going to be completely closeted, or you're just going to be matter of fact, which is kind of what I always tried to be. But the kids really made a difference, such that now my daughter, who lives with her boyfriend about 65 miles south or so, and he is not, but his family's pretty right wing. And we have gotten, Abby and I and Abby's wife have gotten together with them just to sort of get to know them. They've been to my house. They're very polite, nice people. We've been to their home for dinner, and I remember the first time we did that. I don't know where Abby and Sandy went, but all of a sudden Ellie was walking around the house going, Mom, 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 and then she loudly announces to everybody, I've got 3 mothers. You'd think that I would be able to find one of them. She does that in public all the time too. She's very, you know, my kids are very, which I'm really excited about. It's just, this is an okay life. They don't mind telling people that they've got gay parents. And I just think that's really fabulous. And I don't certainly attribute that to LGASP, but I think LGASP has, you know, certainly for me was part of a path of real comfort in just being who I am.
I would like to see it grow in membership and diversity, continue to grow that way. Let's see, I'd like to see more of the mentorship of graduate students, and maybe even undergraduate students. and continue focusing on awareness of, I mean, I'd like that pronouns were something that everyone had on their badges, not just people who need them to, I'd like it to be not a moral issue. I think that ASHA should, I think that just basic supports in the field, you know, I think that ASHA should really use its, you know, political weight to make sure that all of our workplaces are safe in terms of, you know, if one is non-binary or trans, that is particularly stated in the like organization's HR, you know, you know, and more, you know, sexuality, like I guess over gender identity has been supported, but I think that gender identity right now is a huge thing. I think also ASHA needs to support not like non-gendered bathrooms in workplaces and schools, because it negatively impacts. So I heard recently that people who are not neurotypical are more likely to be trans or non-binary. And so I think it just like that statement was like, ah, yes, now it directly impacts a huge population of people we work with. You know, I mean, people with ADHD and autism, right? We have I can't tell you how many of my students with language disorders had one or both of those. So, you know, it directly impacts our clients.
I think right now there are several really high profile issues that need to be on the radar. One is religious liberty and the idea that someone can opt out of treating someone because of their own religious belief. I don't agree with that at all, because you know, where does it end? You know, I can say, well, you cuss, or you are someone who doesn't like gay people based on your political affiliation or whatever you've said when I'm treating you, so maybe I shouldn't treat you, you know, because I would have that right too, wouldn't I? And I just don't want to go there. I think it's the wrong thing. I think I tell students, be neutral when you're meeting anyone. You're going to meet all kinds of people with all kinds of political persuasions, religious affiliations. Just go do your job and focus on that, and treat anyone that you serve equally and fair. I think that CAA accreditation by programs is still something that I don't fully understand how we do that, even though they sent me an email trying to describe to me why they affiliate with institutions of higher learning that don't offer complete protections for LGBTQ plus community. I'd like to see that worked on. And advocacy for LGBTQ plus on boards and committees, and working with ASHA as an advocate on larger issues within the greater community, specifically as it relates to transgender, high profile issues in the news today, as well as anything impacting non-binary community as well.